Welcome to onSodi.com.
In this video lesson we pose the question, what is the correct way to manage highlights? In previous video lessons we discussed both specular highlights and highlight recovery. In some of the images we were able to recover specular highlights with the highlight slider. Let's start by talking some theory first. Photography, which includes editing any images on a computer, is always about making decisions. It's about making decisions on what is good for the image to have its impact as intended, and for the image to say what we want it to say whilst we maintain quality data. Therefore, in coming to decisions about how much highlight you will or won't recover, comes down to the equation of what's good for the image and what is good for the image data. And in the ideal situation, we have both a quality image with quality data. We have said in earlier lessons that specular highlights are allowed to clip, but they don't always have to. Experience and practice are the key elements to making decisions and drawing conclusions about highlights. Let's briefly look at some situations that may assist you in making decisions about the processing of highlights in your images. We will use the same images from our previous exercises and we will be using the threshold method again. We will start this with split screen preview. The area on the left hand side is the before and on the right hand side is the after. Remember there was clipping in the sky, and as it's a specular highlight, it's allowed to clip. As we did in our previous exercise using threshold mode and returning the highlights, the result is that we're getting much better detail appearing in the image compared to what we would if we allowed the specular highlights to clip. In this instance, we would allow those specular highlights to be recovered because it's giving us better detail. Remember, specular highlights are allowed to clip, but they don't have to. On this waterfall image, again in split screen, and I'll recover the highlights. Look how much of this foreground detail is being affected by the recovery of the highlights. The foreground is now darker and lower in contrast. Always consider the effect that your adjustments are having on the remainder of your image. Let's look at this image now. Recovering the highlights. Now I have used the highlight slider so that the after image on the right hand side has had its highlights removed, but it requires some contrast now. Increasing contrast and the overall appeal of the image is now better. The image has much better shadow tone, and it appears sharper and higher in detail. And increasing the contrast gives the image the overall improvement. Remember to adjust the subtleties of images rather than making large aggressive changes. Many fine adjustments are the key to success. Returning to the waterfall image again, and remember we process this file by reducing the highlights, adding some contrast, and we reduce the exposure slider. In this instance, the recovery of the highlights is good and beneficial to the entire image. Looking at this nighttime image again, and you can see that there is drama in this image that should be retained and optimized. I will work on the right image first, and as we saw from our previous example, we use the highlight slider to recover the data. Comparing the two versions, the before on the left and the processed image on the right, we can see that the original image on the left is more dynamic and bright and lively. But the image on the right hand side has had that very important detail recovered on the walkway between the buildings. Therefore, let's now adjust that a little bit more to optimize the feeling of the image. Allowing these highlights to be recovered and then increase the contrast slider, and now there is more impact. Additionally, reducing the exposure gives more detail and overall better result. I'll enlarge the images here and the processed file is definitely better. The highlights have been recovered and therefore there is good data, and the increase in contrast has improved the detail of the building. The sky is darker and better conveys the feeling of nighttime. Again, Always add some contrast when recovering highlights. In conclusion, whether the highlights are specular highlights or just merely bright white, how much of that highlight detail you need to recover is ultimately a decision for you to make. Use your skills of raw processing. Keeping a healthy histogram and adjusting for pleasing outcomes is the best way to success.